In this video, I'm going to give you the first video on heavy weapons teams. I'm starting with mortars because that was the easiest for information that I could find. But even this was pretty complicated for digging some of this information out of old manuals, and for World War II stuff, especially foreign. I had to go to websites for reenactors and stuff like that, and even they were not very complete on their information for what I was looking for. But typically, mortars are placed in a heavy weapons section if it's a infantry company. If it's part of a heavy weapons company, they would be in a heavy weapons platoon. Typically, there is 1 to 4 mortars per squad or section, depending on your organization and the size of the mortars. With a total of 2 to 4 mortars per company, at least in U.S. organizations that I was able to find. A typical mortar team in the U.S. TOE, Table of Organization and Equipment, holds 3 to 5 troops under current doctrine. Now I have on there World War II, the U.S. Army. Pretty much what I found across the board, regardless of caliber, and it was primarily 60 millimeter and 81 millimeter, it was a 6-person crew. It was an NCO, a gunner, assistant gunner, and 3 ammunition bearers. Now, under the current U.S. doctrine, with 60 millimeter, the model they use is the M224 series. It is a 3-person crew, 1 NCO, 1 gunner, and 1 ammunition bearer. So 2 less ammunition bearers than World War II, and I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that current U.S. doctrine is based around vehicles. So for a light unit, they would carry their mortars inside Humvees as much as possible, where during World War II they did it off of primarily light infantry, where they did not have organic transport assets. They did not have trucks or jeeps in the unit. They would have to get them from a transportation company. Now, for ammunition for the 60 millimeter mortar, it comes out between 3 to 4 pounds per mortar shell. 81 millimeter mortars, with the US currently, they issued the M252 series. It is a 5-person crew of an NCO, a gunner, assistant gunner, and 2 ammunition bearers. And with the 120 millimeter mortar, which is a battalion asset, at least in U.S. doctrine, it's the M120 series, and it has the same crew composition as the 81 millimeter from what I've been able to find. Now, the shells for the 81 millimeter are typically, from what I could find, between 6 3/4 pounds to 10 3/4 pounds apiece. Now with the 120 millimeter mortars, they seem to be between 30 to 45 pounds per round. Now with Russian that I could find, for their lighter mortars, their 60 millimeters to 82 millimeters, they had 5 to 6-person crew running a similar organization in World War II to what they do now, maybe a little bit difference in the duties, but the crew size appears to be similar. I mentioned on the board here the Russian 82 millimeter mortar, the 2B9. That is basically an automatic mortar cannon. It's a pretty cool weapon system from what I've seen in the pictures. From what I found out in the past, when the Russians went into Afghanistan, it was a towed weapon system, well still is. What the Russians would do, they would take the wheels off, they would take the trailing legs off, and they would mount the system on top of MTLBs, or as we called them when I was in active duty, meatballs. You have on that crew, it's a 3-person crew. I can't find out a lot of information, but my guess would be 1 NCO, 1 gunner, and 1 ammunition loader. The 2B9 is kind of being phased out, but they are still out there in former comm block countries. I have heard that Poland is still manufacturing them, and they were selling them to the Iraqi army, the current Iraqi army, the Iraqi National Guard, so that they got newer weapon systems. Now, with each mortar team, each mortar squad, I should say, you will have a fire direction center. In that fire direction center, you'll have a forward observer, and he can carry his own radio, or he will have a RTO, a radio telephone operator, with him. He is the one who will be directing where the rounds are being called in. Inside the fire direction center, it is a 5-person team. It'll be 1 NCO, and he is the alternate forward observer from what I have found with current doctrine. You have the RTO, who will receive the call for fire from the forward observer. And then you have 2 personnel that do the calculations for the mortars. Nowadays they will use a ballistics computer. In the old days they used charts and graphs and manuals to determine the elevation that needed to be dialed onto the tube, its orientation, what azimuth it had to be set at. And I will mention with mortars, like artillery, they typically do it off of mils to be a little bit more accurate. If they're trying to do it real quick, they will do it off of degrees. Now, recommendations for a militia heavy weapons mortar crews. I'd say for us, we should be looking at the 6-person organization from World War II as kind of the standard, because that way we have additional ammunition bearers. The majority of the militia movement in the United States and probably around the world is light infantry. We're going to be pretty light on vehicles. So in that case, you'll need those extra ammunition bearers to bring additional rounds. Especially in the case of like the 81mm or 82mm or 120mm. If you capture a 120mm, I definitely believe you should have that with some type of vehicle asset like a light truck or some type of Jeep, a captured Humvee, or some equivalent. You should have a fire direction center, and that fire direction center should have a forward observer. It should have the NCO, the RTO, and the 2 people to check the calculations for the mortars. Now, of those 2 people, 1 person is the chief or primary person to do the calculations, and the other person checks those calculations to see if there's any mistakes before the order is sent to the gun crews for them to start dropping rounds. You always want to double check so that you make sure you're not dropping the rounds on your own people. Now, one thing I came across, which I thought was pretty interesting, in World War II with the German army, with their mortars, when a platoon went out and it had mortars attached to them, It would be lighter mortars like your 60 millimeter, your 50 millimeter, 40 millimeter. I have difficulty trying to find exactly what calibers they had because they used a lot of captured stuff from other countries. But they would have their forward observer who would travel with the lead squad. He would carry a field telephone with him. It would be a type that would be on a shoulder strap. It would be down at his side. There was a preset length of cable that went from his phone down the length of the rifle platoon back to the mortar teams. I think it came out to about 25 meters was the typical. So what would happen, they would engage the enemy. They'd come under contact. The forward observer would grab the field telephone and he'd say, 300 meters, this direction. This is the target. And he would call it out as his infantry in the open, machine guns, its bunkers, its vehicles, whatever. Back at the mortar crew, the NCO would know to add that 25 meters to that calculation. So the forward observer is calling for 300 meters out. He knows that he needs to set the tubes for launching the mortars 325 meters out. So there was less conflict as to what's the real distance. Where if you're using radios, you have to calculate what's your exact position that the mortar's at, where is the forward observer on the battlefield, and you need to add that into your calculations. Where the German army kind of solved that pretty easily if you think about it. Now for all my brothers in the Patriot and Militia movement, always remember, essayons.